Hello, everyone. My name is Mickey, and I am MFS's virtual program coordinator. Today, I'll be acting as your host, and I will be welcoming Rob Woolsey. So, I'm happy for you to join us on our battlefield tour. And today's tour is the end of war, final Canadian operations in Europe. The last days of the Second World War, the First Canadian Army was sitting in the northern Netherlands and northwest Germany, mopping up resistance and liberating towns. The Canadians still had to do a lot of work before they could go home, as these last days of the war were some of the most dangerous of them. I'll hand it over to Rob as we visit the last days of the war and celebrate victory in Europe. Off to you.
Thank you very much, Mickey. Hello, bonsoir, everyone. My name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the Guild of Battlefield Guides and owner-operator of Woolsey's Warwalks, a Canadian-based battlefield tour company that specializes in Canadian First and Second World War battlefield tours in Europe. And so what we're going to be talking about is really the last 2 weeks of the Second World War and Canada's operations at the very, very end. The photo on this title page is actually Canadians about 3 days after the end of the war and expressing their wish to go home after surviving the Second World War. So Military Family Services Europe is not affiliated with any of the companies, apps, or products that I talk about in this presentation, and they don't sponsor. They are not sponsored by, do not sponsor, and do not endorse anything that I mention when it comes to companies, apps, and products. The main thing is those are recommendations that I make to you as an experienced battlefield guide and things that you can use to take away. So we're going to talk a bit of an overview of what we're going to see, some recommended preparations and travel advisories, some helpful hints, fighting. We're going to talk about the fighting for the Delft is how they actually pronounce it, at the town of Delft from the 23rd of April to the 2nd of May 1945, which is by the 5th Canadian Armored Division. We're going to then talk about the crossing of the Ems and Leda Rivers by the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the infamous Water Rats. We're then going to move to the 4th Canadian Armored Division's attack into the Emden-Wilhelmshaven Peninsula. And then we're going to talk about the capture of Oldenburg by the 2nd Canadian Division. Then we're going to jump out of the 1st Canadian Army into the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, who was fighting with British 6th Airborne Division, and they're the furthest eastern unit for the Canadian military in the Second World War, and their advance onto the town of Wijsmar. And then we will talk quickly about the 1st Canadian Corps and what they're doing in the Western Netherlands, and then the German surrender. So the photo in this one, those are Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and those are troops continuing the advance. They are 2nd Canadian Division, and so this is them on the drive to Oldenburg, in fact. So we're talking about two countries today. We're doing some operations in the Netherlands, which is going to be 1st Canadian Corps and 5th Canadian Armored Division. And then we're talking about Germany, which is 2nd and 3rd Infantry and 4th Canadian Armored Divisions. And then the regions we're talking about in the Netherlands is Groningen and Utrecht. And then in Germany, it's going to be Lower Saxony. So in Utrecht, the population is about 1.3 million today, 2.1 million in the Gelderland, which is where, and Groningen, and then 8 million in Lower Saxony. Of course, the languages spoken are Dutch and German, and the closest main international airports are Amsterdam Schiphol, Hamburg, Hanover, and Bremen. So the Netherlands is the 10th, and Germany is the 9th most expensive countries in Europe, so kind of higher than the average. And the last 2 weeks of the Second World War had fighting in the Netherlands only really in the Groningen province, but the 1st Canadian Corps spent a great deal of time in Gelderland and then Utrecht, organizing and delivering food to the rest of the Netherlands to prevent starvation. The 2nd Canadian Corps fought into Germany until the very end as part of the Allied efforts to seize as much of Germany before the Soviet Union could. After the war, the Canadians were quickly pulled back into the Netherlands for repatriation back home. As part of the Cold War, though, the Canadian Army returned to the northern part of Germany in the 1950s. So while it is, we were there fighting in the Second World War, we do return, and we were there from 1950 until 1970 when we moved to the Lahr base. So the weather is generally a mild climate in both countries because it's kind of the same region, with cool, wet winters and dry summers. I always recommend traveling from about the end of April. It starts to get really nice, and then till the end of October when the wet season truly begins. Always bring a rain jacket, always a great idea. It helps break the wind, and you always want really good footwear because a lot of these places that we go visit could be some trails, could be soft ground. You want good footwear when you're moving about. You should always have insurance when you're traveling, both medical and travel insurance. You never know what's going to go wrong. All the memorials and most places in and around this region are child and pet friendly. So it's really good for you to bring your kids and you can experience part of the Second World War there. So check your travel advisories. I put the one for Germany up. Germany and Netherlands both have travel advisories. Just always check them before you travel. It's always a smart move. There's no more COVID restrictions, which is quite nice, although they do still publish them. There's no visa requirements from the EU countries, but there is a maximum 90-day stay if you're from Canada. Now, petty crime is a risk, but Germany and the Netherlands are both considered generally safe. And these areas that we're talking about are really quite safe. They're kind of remote, out of the way parts of those two countries. And so the chances of having high crime or things like that are very limited. There's lots of hospitals in all the urban centers, in Utrecht, in Apeldoorn, in Groningen, in Bremen, Oldenburg. There's a lot of major hospitals and clinics all over the place, so medical care is not really a challenge. Of course, the emergency number in Europe is still 112. And your two closest consulate/embassies is Dusseldorf in Germany, it's the closest one, and The Hague in the Netherlands. So the 1st Canadian Army continued advance into Germany until the very, very end of the war. And that's literally, they just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. But instead of driving east into Germany, they were actually driving kind of in a northeasterly direction, heading towards the North Sea and towards the Baltic. The end of the war in Europe was inevitable by the end of April 1945. The Western Allies were across the Rhine and steadily advancing towards the Elbe River, and the Soviets were only about 50 miles east of Berlin. The 1st Canadian Corps, under Lieutenant General Charles Fuchs, were sitting opposite a defensive line called the Greb Line, a Dutch defensive line first built in 1745 and fought over in the 1940 invasion by the Germans. They were to take no further offensive action in the western half of the Netherlands, and so they spent the last 2 weeks of the war patrolling, holding, cleaning up their area, and dealing with some of the food crisis in the Netherlands. The 2nd Canadian Corps, under Lieutenant General Guy Simons, were going to be busy, though, as they moved on towards the town of Oldenburg, and after that, they were to go to Bremen. And they were eventually supposed to keep driving onwards and northeastward, to Williamshaven and capture some islands in the estuary of the Weser River. So this is kind of our chunk of the battle map where the Canadians are going to spend the last 2 weeks of the war. So basically the 23rd, 25th of April until the 5th of May. The fight for Delft, the 23rd of April to the 2nd of May, 1945, by the 5th Canadian Armored Division. The 5th Canadian Armored Division, under Major General Bert Hofmeister, was attached to the 2nd Canadian Corps for the last 2 weeks of the war. And one of its tasks was to replace the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division in the province of Groningen, which is the province and a town. So it is that they were actually replaced them in the province, which was completed by the 24th of April. The region was held in the northern half and the north and eastern sections by the 5th Canadian Armored Brigade under Brigadier Ian Cumberland, except for a little pocket of Germans in and around the town of Delft. The 11th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Ian Johnson was in the provinces of Friesland and Overijssel in the west. The problem with this initial placement of these troops was that when confronted with the task of clearing Delft, Major General Hofmeister realized it was going to be an infantry fight, and so he had to swap his 2 brigades around. The town of Delft was the largest of the secondary ports in the Netherlands and was located on the left or western bank of the River Ems, and it's about 20 miles from the mouth of the river. The ground in this area was problematic, being flat, with little cover, and a complicated maze of ditches and canals limiting movements. There was no chance for off-road maneuver with this terrain, and because some of it was also intentionally flooded by the Germans, and it was rainy weather, it forced all the vehicles to stay on the roads. The Canadians were facing an estimated force of 1,500 men, made up of, in quotes, a battalion of Marines, which was really just a bunch of sailors pretending to be infantry, and various mixed Kampfgruppen, or battle groups, of men and machines. They did have some artillery and some concrete fortifications as part of the West Wall, and there was an extensive trench system with wire around the port town. The defenders also could call on coastal artillery pieces from the city of Emden and the island of Borkum for additional support. The 5th Canadian Armored Division was not to attack alone, as the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, now under Major General Ralph Kiefler, would attack the town of Emden at the same time. The 11th Infantry Brigade had 2 units attached to it for the attack. The Westminster Regiment, a motorized infantry regiment from the 5th Canadian Armored Brigade, and the British Columbia Regiment for tank support. They also gained a squadron from the 8th Princess Louise New Brunswick Hussars, and later gained a second one when they needed it. They had the 11th Machine Gun Company, which is the Princess Louise Fusiliers, 2 batteries from the Divisional Anti-Tank Regiment, 4 Anti-Tank Regiment, and they had 88 Light Anti-Aircraft Battery from the Divisional Anti-Aircraft Regiment, firing in a ground role. They also had the 8th Self-Propelled and 17th Field Regiments to fire all of their fire support. The opening moves of this battle began on the 25th of April when the Westminster Regiment and the Irish Regiment moved against the perimeter from the south. The Westminster Regiment moved on the right-hand side, working their way with some challenges towards the Ems estuary, taking all but a small spit of land by the end of April, which the Germans decided later to evacuate by water after the fall of Delft. The Irish Regiment attacked from Wagenborgen towards Hevesks, and then on to Otterdam, making steady progress and taking both by the 30th of April. The 2 units faced shelling from the Emden battery and challenges with German road demolitions. In the west, the British Columbia Dragoons held the town of Appingdam, and they were also partially dismounted so that some of the tankers were actually fighting as infantry. But they were also under steady German bombardment, so their advance was hampered. Plus, with the destroyed roads and the maze of watercourses, made their movement of their tanks all but impossible. While it made it challenging, the 29th of April, they, along with the Perth Regiment attacking from the very north beside them, were able to clear up to the town of Marsom. The Perth Regiment, in the days before, had faced the strongest resistance in the attack on Delft, as they took the village of Keerwoerd on the 23rd, 24th of April, and then moved on to Holweerd and Nansum, which they finally took on the 29th of April, 1945, with help from the New Brunswick Hussars and massive air support. During the 4 days of fighting, the Perth Regiment suffered 78 casualties. Now, once these preliminary operations were done, it was time to reduce the pocket and take Delft itself. This was to be the job of the Cape Breton Highlanders. They moved forward and replaced the Perth Regiment late on the 29th of April and pushed to Uitweerd to get into position to attack the port. At 30th of April at 10 a.m., the attack began and progress was slow, delayed by unexpected wire and uncharted minefields all along the dikes, as well as some of the German bunkers. On the 1st of May, the attack was stalled by 4 large bunkers, described by D Company of the Cape Breton Highlanders, who had the job of attacking them, as each the size of a bungalow, each with 4-foot-thick concrete walls. B Company of the Cape Breton Highlanders, with the support from more tanks from the New Brunswick Hussars, eventually took the railway station in the northern end of the town, which helped break the defenders' will to fight, who, the Germans shortly thereafter, were seen trying to get across the Ems and get back into Germany, which was on the other side. They suffered heavily under Allied bombardment as they were trying to make their escape. Delft was cleared by the end of that day, and on the 2nd of May, the Irish Regiment from the south cleared the small hamlets of Weirweird and Farnsum, capturing another 1,300 Germans. The battle was not as costly as had been anticipated, with the Irish Regiment suffering 67 casualties, the Cape Breton Highlanders 68, and the Westminster Regiment 23. And that was to be the closing operation for the 5th Canadian Armored Division in the war. Now today, there's a memorial in Hollerweird to the Canadians, and one to the liberation of Appingdam, and a plaque in the town hall to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, who actually first liberated the town of Appingdam. Wagenborn has a memorial to the Canadian fallen there as well. There's a marker at the original battlefield cemetery that was once established there before the troops were moved back to Holton, and it's just south of the town itself. The other interesting thing is that along the coast, there remain many, many remains of the German Atlantic Wall fortifications because they weren't heavily fought over, and they can all be visited. And many are near the spit of land where you see the battery circle on the map. There's a whole slew of concrete bunkers there that you can go visit today. The top picture is the Hollerweird Memorial, and the one below is the one where the Canadian Soldiers Temporary Cemetery is. Crossing of the Ems and Leda rivers by the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was tasked with capturing the town of Leer, a small port at the junction of the Ems and Leda rivers, which surrounding it making the approach harder and difficult for the Canadians to attack. There was little intelligence on the defenders, but there were indications of a couple of battalions and some weapons in the town, but that their morale was also low amongst the defenders. It would yet be another amphibious attack by the infamous water rats, and it was called Code Operation Duck. And that was to capture Leer and then move on to secure the town of Loga and on the east bank of the Leda River. The 9th Highland Infantry Brigade would lead the assault with the 7th Infantry Brigade to follow through. Brigadier Jim Rockingham of the 9th Brigade chose the North Nova Scotia Highlanders to cross the Leda River on the right-hand side of the attack. The Highland Light Infantry would attack across the center where the two rivers met, and the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders would cross the Ems on the left. Careful consideration for timing, tidal flats, and the need to have the bridgehead secured by nightfall set the attack for 3 p.m. on the 28th of April, 1945. And this is the map showing the positions on the Canadians and then going towards the town of Leer. Supporting this crossing was the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiments and their Sherman tanks, 2 batteries from 6th Anti-Tank Regiment, 20th and 31st Field Company's Royal Canadian Engineers who were going to operate the boats and help run the ferries to get the tanks across. The outside support from the division included Crocodile tanks from A Squadron of 141 Royal Armored Corps Regiment of 79th Armored Division, which are the flamethrower tanks, 11th Field Regiment from the 1st Canadian Army Artillery Group, all 3 regiments of 3rd Canadian Division's artillery, 12th, 13th, and 14th, as well as what they call a pepper pot, which was air defense and machine guns and mortars and anything else they could throw at the Germans, controlled under the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa's commanding officer, who was the heavy weapons battalion commander. Leer, the town, was hit early in the afternoon of the 28th of April by typhoons from 2nd Tactical Air Force, and then 35 minutes before the crossing, a bombardment began. But because of how close the front lines were on the right-hand side, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders would have no support for their crossing. So direct fire from the Camerons, plus some additional fire provided to them by the Canadian Scottish Regiment sitting in reserve, fired them onto their objectives. D Company of the North Nova Scotias led the way, dashing down to the water with their storm boats and then across the river quickly, catching the Germans huddling in their trenches, and as soon as the rest of the regiment was across, they advanced into the southern part of Leer. The Highland Light Infantry were some 2 miles downstream at Leerot, landed against no resistance, and pressed into the center of the town against sniper and anti-tank fire. On the left, only the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry faced resistance, as their crossing came with some 400 yards wide, and they were shot at from both sides as they crossed, losing 15 men drowned when 2 of the boats sank. Brigadier Rockingham questioned the suitability of the lifebelts after the attack, wondering if better quality equipment would have saved his men's lives. They stormed the dike and then went into the western part of the town to clear it. And by 6:50 p.m. on the 29th of April, Brigadier Rockingham had reported his units were on their objectives north of the town of Leer at a cost of 70 casualties to the brigade. Now, these 2 photos are actually photos of the Highland Light Infantry. It's from film footage of them coming down, grabbing their storm boats, and getting ready to cross the river. The 7th Brigade, under Brigadier T.G. Gibson, completed the clearing of Leer, with the Regina Rifles pushing east and clearing the bank of the Leda River. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles captured a place called Julian Park, a forested area northeast of the town of Leer, and the Canadian Scottish moved in and captured Loga without a shot being fired, only hampered by rubble and debris in the streets. The 1st of May had the drive into Germany continue, with the 8th Canadian Brigade, under Brigadier J.A. Roberts, begin to advance into Aurich and seize the crossings on the Ems-Jade Canal, and once across, the 7th Brigade was to cross through and take Aurich itself. The 9th Brigade was going to push towards Emden, but both as 8th and 9th Brigades progressed, they were mostly hampered by demolitions and scattered resistance which held operations up. But the 8th Brigade was just reaching the outskirts of Aurich, and Brigadier Roberts was negotiating the surrender of the town when the call to halt all operations was made by the 1st Canadian Army. The advance to the Emden-Williamshaven Peninsula by the 4th Canadian Armored Division. These guys had a very tough time because they had to cross a canal and got trapped in a whole lot of swampy land. As you can see on the map on the left-hand side, all the little green things are all swamp and flooded areas where they had to try to fight. And their whole goal was to come around and try to get around Oldenburg from the north. The 4th Canadian Armored Division, under Major General Chris Vokes, was struggling in the wet and difficult ground at its bridgehead on the Koosten Canal, suffering casualties against the remnants of the 7th German Fallschirmjäger Division, suffering 402 casualties, in fact, between the 17th and the 25th of April, with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of 10th Infantry Brigade suffering the worst with 41 killed and 105 wounded. The 10th Infantry Brigade, under Brigadier Jefferson, had been spent, and so the 4th Canadian Armored Brigade, under Brigadier Monsell, worked to expand the bridgehead and push on toward Bad Zwischenahn. But the struggle continued, and in an attempt to help, the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, under Brigadier G.W. Robinson, which was now only made up of the 1st Canadian Hussars, as the other units had been tasked to other units, had bolted onto it the Royal Canadian Dragoons and 2 regiments of the British SAS, and they began operations towards Goldenshot, Ocht, Aspen, and Barsel in an attempt to make contact with the 1st Polish Armored Division, which they finally did on the 3rd of May. So that is, the Sherman tank in the background is firing actually into Bad Zwischenahn. They're firing actually onto a barn, firing onto the infantry support. And those are members of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders resting in the town itself after taking of the town. The 2nd Canadian Division, Oldenburg attack, under Major General Matthews, were advancing towards there with all 3 brigades on the 28th of April in cool, wet weather, with the brigades moving from the south, the 6th Brigade under Brigadier General Allard, and the east, 4th Brigade under Brigadier General Cablew, against light resistance, and the 5th Brigade went in from the very north under Brigadier Meagle. They fired leaflets into the city, calling on defenders to surrender, and driving forward until the 3rd of May, they entered the town of Oldenburg as the defenders withdrew, leading to an anticlimactic end to the war for them, as they entered the town with no resistance. So they had a series of drives, as this map shows. They're bouncing all over the place trying to get into Oldenburg, but in the end, they were pushing them back. So these 2 photos on the very left-hand side, one is a radio operator with the Royal Regiment of Canada hiding in a ditch, and the troops on the side of the road are Royal Regiment of Canada as well, waiting to push forward. It was a pretty, I'm not saying quiet time for them, but they were pushing forward, taking casualties, but it was really not much of a fight for them in this area. The 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion and the advance to Weimar. Now this map here shows from where they cross the Rhine River and they go from to Lembeck, to Kostfeld, to Landbergen, to Minden, just around Hanover, up to Usen, Lunenburg, which is actually where the surrender took place, bypassing, of course, Hamburg, and making their way all the way to the Baltic Sea and into Weimar. After Operation Varsity, the 6th British Airborne Division continued to operate, this time with tank support, mostly riding into action, and moving 20 miles a day in many cases as they drove to the Baltic coast, crossing the River Elbe on the 22nd of April 1945, some 40 miles upstream from Hamburg, and the Canadians continued on to Weimar, facing some resistance and fighting, but made it and linked up with the Soviet troops near it. The campaign since Varsity had cost 61 Canadian paratroopers, and they were the unit that made it the deepest into Germany, fitting as they were also the first troops to fight on the continent of Europe, landing first on the 6th of June, 1945. Now that's a Canadian paratrooper linking up with the Soviets actually at Weimar. Officially, the place where they were supposed to be linking up was the Elbe River, but of course the Brits wanted to prevent Denmark from falling into Soviet influence, and so the British airborne divisions ended up driving really, really far in. And of course, 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion was part of 3rd Parachute Brigade of the 6th Airborne, and their whole point was to drive as far as they could east to prevent it from falling under German control or Soviet control. In the West, the 1st Canadian Corps had basically been inactive since the 25th of April, 1945, its operation being suspended to allow for the defeat of Germany inside of Germany. But while it was not fighting, it was arranging food aid and to relieve shortages for the starving Dutch population. There were also negotiations for the surrender of the remaining German forces in the Netherlands, which were being delayed and hampered by German behavior, to which Lieutenant General Charles Fuchs was finished with by the 30th April, when he crossly told the Germans that he would only speak to someone with the real authority in the German command. The Canadians were able to make the arrangements and have food delivered both in ground convoys, as in that photo there on the right, and in naval convoys into Rotterdam to help ease the suffering of the Dutch people. They were moving convoys in some cases of 167 tons a day in ground convoys, which is a real challenge when you're sitting on a defensive line. But they were somehow able to do it. The German surrender. All operations for the Canadians were suspended on the 4th of May, 1945, as negotiations for the unconditional surrender of Germany were occurring. While they could secure and improve their positions and patrol, no direct offensive action was allowed to be taken by anybody. At 8:35 p.m. on the 4th of May, 1945, the news of the German surrender reached General Harry Currier, the commander of the 1st Canadian Army, at his headquarters. The ceasefire was to go into effect on the 5th of May, 1945, at 8 a.m. Lieutenant General Charles Fuchs of the 1st Canadian Corps accepted the German surrender of all the Germans in the Netherlands at the Hotel de Wereld in Wageningen, which still stands today. That hotel stands at the intersection of 5th of May Street and General Fuchs Way. It's actually called 5 May Plain and General Fuchsweg in there, and it still exists today. That hotel was refurbished last time in the 1980s. And that is inside the dining room. That's General Fuchs on the 5th of May accepting the surrender of the Germans. And the photo on the other side is interesting. Those are Dutch civilians watching the German troops being marched out of the Netherlands and being forced to return to Germany. While there had been no action, the last Canadians to be killed in action were Honorary Captain A.E. McCreary, Padre of the Canadian Grenadier Guards, and Lieutenant N.A. Goldie, who went out to bring some wounded Germans in but were killed under mysterious circumstances at the afternoon of the 4th of May, 1945. Most Canadian soldiers, in fact, did not celebrate the end of the war. Most felt relief that it was over. The last phase of the war, the 24th of March to the 4th of May, 1945, had cost 6,298 casualties, of which 1,482 were fatal. And the entire campaign in Northwest Europe had been very costly, with 44,339 Canadian casualties, of which 11,163 had been killed. And that is not counting British, Dutch, Czech, Poles, Belgian units that served in the 1st Canadian Army. The Canadians still died after the ceasefire on the 4th. 28, in fact, died between the 5th and 8th of May in 1945 in all services, either in Germany or the Netherlands. And they're commemorated today in Holten, Groesbeek, and Celle War Cemeteries. Celle War Cemetery is a cemetery inside of Germany. It's a couple of air crew are there. But most of the Canadians that were killed in this last phase of the war, you can see at Holten. The 2 that died in Groesbeek were actually accidents when they were coming out. So the end of the Second World War for Canada didn't just end with all the shooting and the fighting. It was going to take months and months and months of pulling back, sorting through stores, and trying to get the troops home, as well as getting ready to send troops to fight the war against Japan, which luckily enough ended in August. And so those troops that were earmarked to go to the Pacific ended up not having to go. Now, Canada did have a minor occupation role. They sent a battalion of mixed troops, a company from each division under the commander of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders into Berlin for a very brief period of time as part of the occupation force. And there was a reconstituted 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, Canadian Army Occupation Force. And so instead of being active service force, like this fighting component of the military was, for the occupation, they created a division mirroring the 7th, 8th, and 9th Brigades. But they were the 2nd battalions of those regiments. But Canada didn't play a role in the occupation. They weren't really interested. And so the Canadians were all pulled back and all out of the Netherlands by 1946. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you for everyone joining us today for another edition of Battlefield Tours with Rob Woolsey. If you would like to see more, just click on this playlist and you'll have all of our recordings with him. I hope to see you on the next one and see you soon.
Bye, everyone.